December 19, 1944. St. Vith, Belgium. The wind off the Ardennes cut through ruined shopfronts as a two-man American team dragged a green tube into a doorway. The taller soldier, bracing the rear end toward a cobblestone alley, while his partner, ready blackened by soot, sighted along a simple front post toward the flank of a German tank nosing past a burned bus. They had seconds to do the math that mattered: distance, angle, speed. The operator exhaled. The assistant yelled, "Clear." A flash detonated behind them with a vicious backblast that hurled dust into the street, and a fin-stabilized rocket streaked 10 houses down and buried its shape-charged nose into the tank's thinner side plate. For an instant, nothing changed. Then a bright starburst inside the hull, smoke venting through hatches, a track clattering off the sprocket. The machine stopped moving. The two Americans lifted the tube and sprinted through a courtyard, because they knew the second rule of their weapon as well as the first. It was light enough to carry anywhere, and it made you very popular with enemy gunners if you stayed in one place. What looked like a toy was, by December 1944, a mature battlefield tool that let ordinary infantry dislocate the plans of armored forces many times their weight. The thesis of this story is straightforward. The American 36-inch rocket launcher, nicknamed the bazooka after a comedian's whimsical musical contraption, gave rifle platoons a portable, cheap, and fast anti-tank punch that shifted the balance in countless small fights. It did not win the war by itself, could not kill every tank from every angle, and carried limitations the enemy learned to exploit. But in the arithmetic of modern warfare, time saved at the platoon level compounds into miles gained at the corps level. Its existence turned many otherwise impossible situations into workable problems. That is why senior Allied commanders, Dwight D. Eisenhower among them, later grouped it with other humble, practical innovations as part of the war's decisive toolkit. To understand how an open tube and a rocket could wound giants of steel, you need the chemistry and geometry of a shaped charge and the institutional habits of an army that valued simple, buildable solutions. The physics came from research into the Monroe effect, the observation that an explosive with a hollow cavity focuses its energy into a narrow, high-velocity jet capable of piercing steel far thicker than the charge itself. The American ordnance community paired that principle with a small rocket motor and a finned tail to stabilize flight, creating the M6 series of rockets whose copper-lined cones could, under favorable impact angles, punch through several inches of homogeneous armor. Instead of asking a bullet to be faster than a tank's armor was strong, the bazooka asked a tiny, cunning warhead to do surgical work at short range. The launch platform followed the same logic of economy: a thin steel tube with rudimentary sights and a shoulder rest, a wire to arm and fire the rocket, and a set of doctrine notes that insisted this thing be used by teams who rehearsed every step. Early versions weighed roughly as much as a rifle. A gunner and assistant gunner could crouch behind a hedgerow, sleep in a cellar with it propped against a wall, or sling it over a shoulder and run. Effective range against a moving tank was typically measured in dozens of yards, not hundreds. Under battlefield conditions, many kills happened inside 80 to 100 yards, where a side or rear plate could be engaged at an oblique angle. On paper, the later M6A3 rocket could penetrate on the order of 3 inches of armor under 90-degree impact. In practice, slope, skirts, and hit location mattered as much as raw penetration figures, which is why training emphasized aiming for tracks, engine decks, turret rings, and lower side plates, rather than the thickest frontal arcs. The first operational steps from idea to factory floor were fast by wartime standards. In 1942, the weapon moved from test stands to shipping crates, arriving in time to see combat that autumn. In North Africa, where initial American armor infantry coordination was still uneven, the rocket launcher's short reach and the inexperience of new units sometimes limited results, but it delivered reliable effects against lighter German and Italian vehicles and against fixed positions where a heat jet did ugly work through concrete or timber. By 1943, as U.S. doctrine matured in Sicily and Italy, platoons treated the bazooka as a tool for ambushes, street fighting, and breaking machine gun nests. The weapon's versatility mattered as much as its anti-tank role. You could shoot at a bunker embrasure, a stone wall concealing an MG-42, a sniper's attic. Infantry who once had only grenades and rifle fire to deal with such problems now had a one-man breaching shot. Numbers tell part of the story of why this weapon scaled. Compared to a tank destroyer or a medium tank, a bazooka launcher and a crate of rockets could be built by the thousands with minimal strategic materials. By the war's end, American factories had produced on the order of several 100,000 launch tubes and well over 10 million rockets. A mass that ensured distribution down to the smallest units and replacement when tubes were lost or damaged. The weapons unit cost, a rounding error next to a tank's, meant that commanders could afford to saturate defensive lines with two-man teams and stockpile ammunition forward. Logistics always, the quiet decider, favored whatever could ride in a jeep or be humped over a hedgerow. Germany noticed. The capture of intact examples in Tunisia in early 1943 provided a direct pathway to a heavier German copy. The 88 mm reshaped Panzers, nicknamed Panzerschreck, by the troops which paired a larger rocket and a sheet metal shield to protect the firer from backblast. In parallel, German engineers fielded the Panzerfaust family, a disposable, recoilless launcher firing a powerful heat warhead at very short range. These weapons, like the American original, answered the same battlefield question: how to give an infantryman without a gun tube on tracks a meaningful way to stop armor. The transnational convergence on shaped charges foreshadowed the post-war world. But in 1944, it meant the US infantry faced opponents who also carried simple, anti-tank tubes that thrived in cities and woods. And the Germans, aware of heat threats, ringed Panzer IVs with thin Scherzen plates designed primarily to defeat Soviet anti-tank rifles, yet capable, in some circumstances, of disrupting a shape-charged jet if detonation occurred prematurely. They spread pastes like Zimmerit on holes to defeat magnetic mines. It did not stop heat jets, but it speaks to a growing cat-and-mouse around infantry anti-tank techs. Normandy tested everything. The bocage was a hedgerow maze that compressed ranges and hid armor until it was almost on top of you. In such country, the bazooka's limitations short reach, sensitivity to angle turned into advantages. Teams pre-selected gaps and corners, coordinated with riflemen to draw tanks into kill zones, and aimed for blind spots. The launcher's backblast forced discipline. Gunners learned to shoot from doorways with a clear rear arc or two, carve firing ports, and assistants shouted warnings before each shot to keep friendly troops out of danger. Infantry companies that had struggled to bring heavy guns forward through earthen walls now had organic explosive power for busting through reinforced hedgerows and stone farmhouses. After-action summaries from June and July 1944, while varied in detail, consistently credit the rocket launcher with disabling light armor, self-propelled guns, and half-tracks, and with suppressing fortified positions in the moments that let riflemen close and finish. When heavier Panthers and Tigers appeared frontally on open ground, companies pulled tank destroyers and artillery. But in the twisted lanes where a turret could not traverse and a driver could not see, a team with 2 or 3 rockets could wreck tracks, blow off road wheels, or set the engine on fire from the rear. Urban fighting in France and Germany made the case even sharper. At Brest-Ocken and through the Hurtgen, narrow streets and multi-story stone blocks turned armor into vulnerable steel rooms if the infantry screen faltered. Bazooka teams took basements and upper floors that let them shoot down onto engine grills. They learned to fire at the moment a tank committed to a turn, exposing its side. They learned to hit a track first, then pump a second rocket through a vulnerable spot once the turret lost traverse. Companies paired bazookas with smoke grenades to blind optics and with machine guns to keep accompanying infantry's heads down while the gunner took aim. Because the launcher was light and fast to re-aim, a single team could engage, displace, and engage again within the same block. The Ardennes was the crucible that cemented the weapon's reputation among those who had to stake their survival on it. German armored spearheads, including Panthers with thick sloped fronts, poured into road nets that channeled them past towns, bridges, and forest trail junctions. American defenders, often under strength, burned gasoline dumps to deny fuel and set up roadblocks of abandoned vehicles and felled trees. Bazooka teams wired those obstacles with overlapping fields of fire. In many remembered ambushes, the weapon did not blow through a Panzer's glacis. It did something more practical under the circumstances. It broke a track and turned a 50-ton breakthrough tool into an immobile pillbox at the head of a column, buying minutes that the defense turned into hours by calling artillery on the jam. A disabled lead tank in a defile could block a battalion. In winter cold, some early pattern ignition systems demanded careful handling. Soldiers learned to keep rockets warm, to test connections, to carry spare wires. Later models improved reliability, and fieldcraft closed the rest of the gap. The weapon's lightweight nature meant a platoon could scatter half a dozen tubes across a village and keep the enemy guessing where the next flash would come from. It mattered that the bazooka democratized anti-tank effects. Before its arrival, killing a tank demanded either a friendly tank gun, a towed anti-tank piece that resented mud and narrow streets, or risky close attacks with satchel charges and mines. With the rocket launcher, a rifle platoon could integrate anti-tank action into its own plan, rather than hope that heavier support synchronized perfectly with the infantry's problems. The launcher's throughput seconds to fire, seconds to reload, 2 men to move fichi patro tempo. In an army that emphasized initiative at small unit levels, this was empowering. Platoon leaders could decide to emplace a bazooka to cover a lane while they shifted a machine gun to another roof, rather than waiting for a battery to lay in a mission or a tank to arrive. In defensive holds where radio nets were saturated, that independence multiplied. The enemy's responses, beyond aid-on armor and tactical caution, forced further adaptation. German tankers learned to put infantry on the flanks, and to keep moving through likely ambush points, to hose windows and hedges with suppressive fire, to use high explosive shells to collapse buildings suspected of hiding teams. Against that, American units stacked bazooka teams with rifle grenadiers and bars, building small local mixers that could answer escort infantry while still reserving the rocket for the vehicle. The best commanders chose engagement geometry. They positioned teams to exploit the fact that sloped frontal armor on a Panther still left a relatively thin lower side behind the second road wheel, and that rear shots often ignited fuel or oil. A 2.36-inch heat jet did not care whether steel bore a prestigious German model name. It cared about impact angle and plate thickness, and the battlefield provided both if you made the enemy commit. The bazooka's value was not confined to Europe. In the Pacific, where Japanese tanks were fewer and generally more lightly armored than German types, the rocket launcher delivered more reliable anti-tank kills and proved versatile against caves, log bunkers, and pillboxes. Infantry learned to aim slightly low on embrasures to funnel the jet into the fighting compartment. In jungle fights, where hold guns bogged, a 2-man bazooka team could hike along a ridge and bring direct fire to positions that would otherwise demand flanking maneuvers under fire. Again, the theme repeats. Portability converts into opportunity. When soldiers and historians after the war tried to count what the bazooka destroyed, they ran into methodological traps. War records are noisy. Many kills are claimed by multiple weapons, and the difference between destroyed and disabled long enough to be overrun matters, but is hard to reconstruct from fragmentary notes. Contemporary divisional reports and retrospective studies vary, but the pattern that survives is less about raw totals than about distribution. In innumerable small engagements, the rocket launcher provided the marginal capability that tipped a local fight. That is why experienced officers cared about it. It was a guarantee that any patrol might carry a pocket of armor-killing power. If the weapon did not appear in glamorous tallies of tigers destroyed frontally at range, it consistently appeared in the last paragraph of company after-action reports under phrases like knocked out, disabled, set afire, forced crew to bail, or neutralized MG nest. In the language of operations, those words translate into time saved, ground held, and momentum. Design evolution under fire made the tube better, even as the enemy adapted. Mechanics simplified the launcher's construction and maintenance, improved sights and grips, and standardized rockets that were less prone to premature detonation or tail failures. Units improvised aiming drills and range cards specific to their sectors. Ammunition supply officers learned the hard lesson that you could not issue this weapon without matching it with batteries, spare wires, and carry bags that kept fins straight. Leaders learned to assign both a primary and a fallback team, and to rove their positions to avoid the obvious smoke signature of backblast. Training films hammered home the danger arc behind the weapon. Medics in Normandy and the Ardennes could point to burns on careless comrades as proof. German developments looped back into Allied tactics in interesting ways. When Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks appeared in volume, American and British armor responded with prudent standoff in cities, infantry screens, and ad hoc armor screens on vulnerable hull zones. Bazooka teams, used to moving toward armor, now also took on counter-rocket roles, suppressing suspected Faust positions with quick shots. The same lightweight tube that could kill a half-track could put explosive into a window frame at the moment a German grenadier leaned out. City fighting became an ugly duel of seconds, where having any weapon you could carry up a staircase mattered. A fair critique appeared in late 1944 as well. Against the newest heavy armor, the 2.36-inch warhead was marginal frontally, and sometimes even from the side if angle and standoff were wrong. Units learned to carry more rounds per team because first shots failed often enough that success required multiples from better angles. American ordnance was already studying larger diameter launchers. The post-war 3.5-inch super bazooka would answer those lessons decisively, though it arrived too late for World War II. But that critique should live alongside the reality of how most tanks died in 1944-45, not in fair duels on a range line, but strangled in traffic jams, immobilized on narrow roads, pounded by artillery once stopped. A light weapon that could cause those stoppages, cheaply and often, was strategically potent. The weapon's social and industrial footprint also belongs in a serious account of why it mattered. Everything about the bazooka fit an American war economy biased toward volume. It demanded little metal per unit, used manufacturing lines that could be spread across subcontractors, and required minimal machine tool time compared to precision-bored gun barrels. You could crate them in bulk, fly or truck them forward, and train a replacement team in hours rather than weeks. When weather or terrain grounded aircraft and bogged tanks, the bazooka kept its schedule: 2 men, 2 arms, and room to move. That resilience, indifferent to fuel convoys and runway conditions, maps directly onto why commanders cherished it. It never replaced heavier weapons. It bridged the gaps between them. American soldiers sometimes laughed at the tube because it looked like a prank from a comedy skit, which is nearly how it acquired its name. A vaudeville performer's odd instrument lent its nonsense word to the launcher. The irony is pleasing in hindsight, because the thing it named was pragmatic to the core. It turned a principle from a chemistry textbook into a daily, repeatable effect that even a green unit could produce if leaders kept their teams supplied and their drills sharp. And it traveled. Allied partners used it. Soviet units tested it under Lend-Lease, and the Germans reverse-engineered it into weapons the Americans in turn had to counter. That exchange of ideas under fire is the real signature of a practical design. It forces everyone to think differently about what an infantryman can do to a tank. By the time Allied armies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, bazooka teams were standard furniture in rifle companies. Their presence shaped how platoons cleared villages and secured bridges, how they posted sentries at roadblocks, how they rehearsed night actions against the possibility of a sudden tracked silhouette at a crossroads. Even where armored killing glory was the job of tank destroyers and fighter bombers, the bazooka's jobs in the margins multiplied. Its rockets collapsed walls that blocked lines of fire, scared crews out of still-running vehicles, and made assaulting infantry crouch at the wrong moment. If war is, as operational analysts like to say, a contest of friction, the tube and its 6-pound rockets manufactured friction in the enemy's gears, reliably, and at the lowest echelons. The legacy is less about the specific measurements of the M6's copper cone than about a doctrine lesson that persists. Lightweight, soldier-carried precision effects that reduce the enemy's armored immunity or to behavior. After 1945, every army absorbed that insight. Germany's Panzerfaust lineage flowed into Eastern Bloc disposable launchers. The American bazooka's line extended into larger rockets and, eventually, into the disposable and reloadable anti-tank weapons that defined later conflicts. Ask why any modern mechanized unit never moves without infantry screens, and you will find a long shadow cast by these World War II tubes. When Eisenhower reflected on the eclectic mix of tools that helped convert industrial power into battlefield results, he did not put the bazooka on a pedestal above the jeep, the all-weather transport, or the bulldozer. He put it exactly where it belonged, among the small things that multiplied the power of larger systems by being present everywhere, at the right moments. Return to the doorway, Instant Vith. The two soldiers who fired that shot did not write in their report that they destroyed a specific numbered Panther at 0937 hours, at number 12 Hochstrasse. They wrote that they checked their rear was clear, fired, saw the track come off, and then moved to their secondary position, as planned. A battalion staff officer later diagrammed the morning and drew a hash mark where the column stopped, then traced a looping arrow that showed where artillery fell once the road clogged. Miles away, on a different map, a corps staff colored a boundary where a reserve could hold a line for another night. The bazooka's real contribution lives in that chain. It is a weapon of seconds and yards, whose effects radiate outward because they change the timing of everything else. That is why a green tube that looked like a gimmick earned a place on any honest list of wartime enablers. It carried the chemistry of a focused jet into the hands of 19-year-olds, and asked of them only that they aim well and move fast. Against a heavy tank frontally at 200 yards, it was not a miracle. Against a column in a village in winter, it was a plan. Across France, Belgium, the Rhineland, and the Pacific Islands, it made 1,000 local plans possible. Count the destroyed machines if you can. What matters as much is all the German tanks that did not arrive on time, the armored cars that did not turn the corner. The morale checks failed because a small tube made of stamped steel and wires changed what seemed safe. A toy in appearance, a tool in purpose. The bazooka fit the American way of war in 1944 and 1945. Simple, numerous, and effective in the hands of ordinary soldiers. As we approach the end of our remembrance today, we're grateful you listened to this full story with us, and we're glad our archive has nourished your heart and soul. War stories have probably also marked your family's life in some way, haven't they? Maybe you wore the uniform yourself, or perhaps someone you loved did. Your father, a grandfather, or even an uncle. If so, we'd like to invite you to add another chapter to this record. Share with our community a war story that resonates in your family in the comments below. It could be a family tale, a saved letter, a lesson learned on a flight line, or in a muddy field. Anything you want. Tell us from where and what time are you listening to this message. This contribution helps to grow and keep our community together. We can't let these incredible stories be lost in time. The World War II Archives channel was created to honor and preserve these memories. Finally, if this resonates with you, we invite you to subscribe and perhaps share it with a friend who also recognizes the importance of these tales. Stay tuned so you don't miss the next one of our lost archives yet to come.